At this point, we have the two panelists. Bruce hasn't shown up, so I guess we're not going to have the third talk, but we're happy to take some questions. Anybody want to ask the speakers about some of their experiences at this point? There are microphones on the side. There are no questions, so we can make up some. You have a question? Go ahead. Yeah, you just say it, I will repeat it. So the question is,
I believe the question was, first of all, on the NIH fellowships, the level of competition for them. And quite frankly, I don't have an answer to that. I can probably tell you somebody who would. And then the other part of the question, if I recall correctly, is what are the opportunities after that? Okay. And that I can certainly answer. Quite frankly, we do not have enough good people in tech transfer. And so if somebody has a good training in science and comes out of 2 years of training from NIH, I would say you're going to have excellent prospects. You can look at universities. You can look at research institutions. You can look at industry. Places like Cubist are going to hire people who can understand the science, know what the academic issues are, because then they're going to have to negotiate with folks like me. So Judith and I were just talking how, you know, we're each learning the other side of the technology. And when she talked about, you know, investigations she managed, a lot of those were based on research agreements with academics. So quite frankly, I view technology transfer as really a growing field. Again, some of the advantages are I can put my work in my desk at the end of the day. I don't have to come back and do time points at midnight and 3 a.m. like I did when I was in the lab. And as I said, I think academically and intellectually it's very challenging.
I'd like to ask the panelists a question. I mean, one of the interesting things that Dr. Melnikov showed is that 30 years ago there were 7 people doing this, and now there are 1,000 people doing that. So you could have said, gee, this would have been a great area to get into at that time if you had the foresight to think ahead. And then the question is, clearly, there are areas today in which there are only 7 people working, in which there's going to be things that are going to be needed in the future. And if one can only had some foresight, one could do very well. Now, foresight is unfortunately something that tends to be 20/20 and not something that we can see into the future. But I wonder whether either of you see areas that may be growing that right now are minuscule and where some of the people in the audience may be thinking about. Some 2020.
I have the bad news of saying that I'm sure all of us are aware, pharmaceutical companies have cut back on antibiotic research. So I have that as the not good foresight. There are still positions out there. I also don't, you know, there's still opportunities. It wasn't that difficult to look. I joined after the biotech companies started to become less important. But that is not an area that is as growing as quickly as I would have hoped. However, I do see a swing back now. They've been hurt by a couple of other issues by the FDA lately, by their own big drugs for the long-term care. So I do see a comeback because, as I say it to people, my company said the bugs always win. You know, there's always going to be new resistance. There's always going to be a need for new antibiotics. There's a desperate need for new gram-negative antibiotics out there. So I hope that I'm still riding on a tide that will continue to grow because I think it has been cut back too far. But I can't promise anything.
What about in the non-anti-infectives? The microbiologists will still be hired in because a lot of things depend on fermentation and things like that.
Yeah, that's still ongoing, fermentation products. But again, most companies cut and got rid of their entire fermentation groups. We have in-house fermentation, but we were unique in that. So I think as far as what's growing, I think it's all going to come back. I think there's a huge need for more antibiotics and more research. And I do agree that it's the biotechs and the small pharmaceuticals that currently are holding that bag and moving that forward because we don't have the big conglomerates to deal with. But I'm not sure what the next big thing is. I've definitely learned a lot about tech transfer. I didn't realize that that had become so huge, but I'm not sure. If I knew, I'd be joining that too.
Do you have any
I have a few areas that I can certainly think of. There are more than 7 people right now. But I constantly try and think of what are the new areas because if there's opportunity for our scientists or researchers. Remember, I deal with the early stuff that nobody really knows what it is, and part of my job is to figure out what it can be used for. So, quite frankly, in the venture community, the hottest area right now is biofuels, and I think that is an area where there may be significant opportunities for microbiologists. Because there you're going to be using the fermentation and a lot of the techniques. And there are many, many companies being started in that area. So the next Amgen and Genentech are going to be in the biofuels industry, and that's where there's a lot of money going. In my field, probably the 2 areas that I've been seeing grow significantly that are very exciting are vaccines. In biotech, things kind of go in and out of fashion. I've been around long enough to remember when monoclonal antibodies were found and everybody was sure that was the magic bullet, and then lived through the almost demise of Centocor with the first clinical trial failure. I actually had the fortune or misfortune to be around the corner from the University of Pennsylvania Institute for Human Genome Therapy, and everyone remembers when gene therapy was going to be the next magic bullet. And we saw that whole area. So things are always going to be coming and going in and out of fashion. Well, fortunately, vaccines are coming back into fashion, and that's an area certainly that intersects a lot with microbiologists. And related to that, in my job, I've had a tremendous increase in doing licensing and other negotiations with companies outside of the U.S., in the developing world, Asia, China, India, fabulous opportunities in India. I mean, what is going on there is just amazing. And also South America. So those are kind of some of the areas I'm seeing.
Actually, I think that's a great insight you just heard about. I mean, clearly, you're all seeing the rising price of fuels, and this is an area where there's a lot of interest in biotechnology and new. So it may be that if people are thinking about jobs in areas where currently the industry is minuscule, but will be forward to look in that, because that certainly will be in the future. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, right here.
Okay.
Hello. This question is for Judith, actually. Can you describe the transition between academia and industry? Was it a smooth transition, or what were the major differences? Because in academia, yes, you're dealing with the deadline of, you're going to need to get your PhD to be able to get out of there, but then now you're in an industry where you have deadlines, products need to go out. How did you deal with that transition?
The first 3 months were awful. It was a very different type of environment. I'm incredibly flexible as far as what I can and can't do. I'm an incredibly hard worker, and I think almost anybody who gets a PhD has to be, which is why it ended up loving every minute past the first 3 months. I think it's like having a child, right? The first 3 months are the hardest. So it wasn't a difficult transition in that the work was impossible. It was all of a sudden a new environment that I had not expected. I didn't know that there were clinical departments and that there's clinical operations and commercials split into marketing and publications. And even when they would throw out, oh, this group is doing that, I didn't even know what the group was. I had absolutely no idea, besides microbiology, what went into these companies. There's discovery microbiology at our company. There's clinical microbiology, and figuring out how all these pieces move together and what my role was. There was, as far as the job, the figuring out the investigators, sure, there was a lot of legwork to get caught up in the portfolio that already existed and start that running, but that wasn't the hard part. It was figuring out how everything moved together and how you do get your own opinions out there and how you become more involved. All of us, I'm sure, want to be as involved as possible, and I wanted to be at the forefront of anything new, and how do I get my name and people become aware of who I am, and that just took time. But yeah, it was an interesting transition.
Judith, would you comment on a question that often comes up, should you do a postdoc for industry?
I think there's both. So Arturo asked, should you do a postdoc before industry or should you go to industry? I think there's mixed reviews on that, and I think it depends on what you're looking at and what the jobs are and if they require it. Most jobs still require a postdoc, even in industry. There are industry postdocs that you can do, and those are often, bench-related and bench-type work. This was not a bench position, and therefore they did not require a postdoc. In this particular job, if I would have done a postdoc, I don't think it would have benefited me because, again, my job is so different than anything I would have done a postdoc in. So I think the jury's still out. Depends on what you would like to do and what you get out of it. I don't think I was hurt, but I did interview at a company, and they looked at me and said, well, we think that scientists who do postdocs are smarter. And I said, well, I would like to prove you wrong. But again, it's all in what the individuals that you're interviewing with are as well, and whether they did postdocs or not.
Yeah, hi, I have a question for Judith also. I was wondering, because you talked a lot about the external research, which I guess is what you're involved in. Could you tell me a little bit more about the in-house research at Cubist and how that is sort of balanced with the external?
Right. I mentioned just the external because that is my job. I don't do any of the internal research. As most companies, we do have internal research. Currently we have a natural product screening group. They're looking, again, since daptomycin is a natural product and we do have fermentation in-house, we have a large natural product screening group in-house. Once those compounds make it through that particular part of screening, we have a discovery microbiology group that does all of the testing on any new compounds that make it through there. They also work on mechanism of action, mechanism of resistance. We have a molecular group looking at different ways of genetically engineering the strains that make these different antibiotics. So we do have in-house research, and these are more typical types of bench research that you would think of. They have, again, it depends on the level you're at and how long you've been at the company, whether you have a fully assigned project or whether you're allowed to think outside the box. We have individuals that work on just things that we're looking into in licensing, so therefore we get to use and confirm some of their data. We have a group that just looks at that, where they determine whether what's in these in licensing packages is accurate. So there's a lot of different options as far as actual bench research.
Thank you.
When you started in the industry, did you start it as a microbiologist because you worked as a microbiologist in the company, in the pharmaceutical company, right? Because a lot of industrial companies, they required quite a lot of years working experience in the industry. So I'm quite impressed that you started as a microbiologist, and you even didn't did a postdoc. You directly entered the company from the graduate school. So how did you persuade them that you don't have any working experience?
Right. It is unusual and it isn't common. I will start with that. This particular position was advertising for a microbiologist with a PhD with 0 to 3 years experience. I had 0, so I fit right into that description. And, and the reason for that is because it was such a unique job description where my initial role was dealing with these external studies, and they thought it would be difficult to find somebody with more experience willing to start out with that as their primary job. So again, it is just hitting the pavement, looking out there, seeing what's out there. But again, a postdoc would be considered experience. So if you've done a 2 or 3 year postdoc, you've got those 2 or 3 years experience when you are looking for work. And it's just seeing where you are, but don't hesitate because it says 2 to 4 years experience. Why not send your resume, your CV in? Why not call somebody there and see what it really means? You don't know. I did get interviews at places where they were looking for somebody with more experience. I was motivated. I wanted a job, so I would go and do it. And people saying no to me doesn't hurt my feelings. So just move forward.
This question is for Judith again. I'm curious to know, what kind of training did you receive to actually do your job within the company? Because I'm sure there were parts of it that you maybe didn't know how to do, and
Right.
what kind of training?
I was lucky, when I started with the external studies, we had an ongoing clinical trial at Cubist. We had our Staph aureus bacteremia and endocarditis trial. There was another microbiologist in our department. Okay, we have a really small department. But there was another microbiologist who was running that trial, and I was able to learn from him as he was doing it. This was towards the tail end of that trial, but I got to work and QC the database. I helped put together the final supplemental new drug application that went to the FDA, and I also got very well versed on what that protocol looked like. So I got on-the-job training, but they do have courses in clinical trials, clinical development. I know Boston, in the Boston area, we have a lot of different courses that you can take. I did discuss it with my boss, and we decided that at this point I didn't need to take them because I had been working so closely with these different groups to get the information. But there are courses you can take, and you can take them at night, and they're only courses. Again, they're not a full-out class or anything along those lines. They're courses that are maybe one semester evenings. So they are available if that is what you're interested in.
Experience is that international students have no options but to go for a postdoc, because especially smaller biotech and pharmaceutical companies, they don't want to deal with the issues of like getting a working visa sponsored and stuff like that. So based on your experience in your company, would you have any ideas on that?
Not specifically as far as what our willingness is or is not to work with the visa situation. I do know that we have hired a few individuals with postdoc training and all of that at the company. I know that we've done that, but I don't know the specifics of their visa status or not. So,
thank you.
I'm sorry.
Hi, this is for both of you. We're trying to develop a group at our university educating the postdocs and PhD students on what's available outside of academia. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions besides the Autumn and Leslie websites that we could give to the students and postdocs.
Do you have a tech transfer office at your university?
Yes, we are working with the tech transfer office.
Then I would have the head of your tech transfer come and talk at that session. People in my position are used to that type of outreach. That's a big part of our job.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Maybe we can going once, going twice. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming. And join me in a round of applause for the speakers who put a lot of work into this talk.